The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $45, and Bud Halloran laughed loud enough that the rafters of the old Grange Hall in Miller's Ford seemed to shake a little dust down onto the folding chairs. It was the 12th of April, 1978, at the Pruitt Estate auction, and the last lot of the afternoon was a locked black typewriter case with the leather strap cracked clean through and the brass corners green with age. Nobody but the quiet old man in the third row, who had lifted one finger like he was pointing at something only he could see. The case sat on the folding table under the yellow light of the hall's overhead bulbs, and it looked exactly like what it was, which was something the world had decided to forget. The lid was hinged shut with a small brass lock, and someone long ago had wrapped a strip of black electrician's tape around the seam and then wrapped it again, and then a third time, and the tape had gone brittle and gray at the edges. The handle was worn smooth in the middle, where a thumb had rested 1,000 times. There was a nameplate on the front, but the letters on it had been scratched out with something sharp, so all a person could see was a shape where a name used to be. The man who had bought it was Elmer Coyne, and he was 71 years old that spring. He had lean shoulders that had begun to stoop the way a fence post stoops after 40 winters, and his face was lined the way a creek bed is lined, deep and patient and carrying the shape of everything that had ever passed over it. He wore a canvas jacket, the color of oatmeal, and a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, and on his head sat a work cap that had once been navy blue and was now the color of an old bruise. His hands were what you noticed if you knew what to look for. They were long-fingered and scarred at the knuckles, and the pads of his thumbs were flat and shiny, from a lifetime of pressing against small brass tumblers and steel pins. Elmer Coyne was a locksmith, and he had been a locksmith since he was 14 years old. Bud Halloran was 49, and he sold farm insurance out of a storefront on Main Street with his name painted across the window in gold letters 2 feet high. He was heavy-set in the way a man becomes heavy-set when he stops walking his own fields, and his face was clean-shaven and ruddy from the 2 martini lunches he took at the Elks. That afternoon he wore a checkered sport coat, the color of a rooster, and a gold pinky ring that caught the light every time he raised his hand. His Cadillac was parked outside, cream-colored and clean as an operating room, and it made Elmer's rust-red 1962 Ford pickup look like something dredged out of a pond. Bud slapped his knee and turned to the men on either side of him. $45, he said, for a lunchbox that don't open. Boys, I have seen him buy junk before, but this here is the Cadillac of junk. Somebody get old Elmer a can opener. Somebody get him a stick of dynamite. And the men around him laughed, the way men laugh when the loudest one in the room has decided the joke is over. The nickname was born there in the Grange Hall that afternoon, the lunchbox. From that day forward, whenever Elmer Coyne walked into the diner or the feed store, someone would ask him how the lunchbox was coming along, and someone else would laugh. What Bud Halloran did not see, and what nobody else in that Grange Hall saw, was the small thing Elmer had seen. The case sat at an angle on the folding table, and when the auctioneer's assistant had lifted it and set it down, it had not made the sound a typewriter case makes. A typewriter case, even a good one, has a certain hollow music to it, the ring of empty space around metal keys. This case had rung dull and heavy, the way a case rings when what is inside it is packed tight and does not move. And the scratches on the nameplate were not the kind a person makes to erase a name they are ashamed of. They were careful and deliberate and small, and Elmer had seen scratches like that before, on locks that had been worked over by someone who did not want a name known but did not want the metal itself damaged. That was the language of a person hiding something they still respected. Elmer had learned to read those signs from his master, an old bohemian named Anton Ries, who had taken him on as an apprentice in 1921 in a shop that smelled of oil and pipe tobacco and hot brass. Anton had said many things over the years, but the one Elmer had kept close was this: "A lock is a promise a stranger made to himself, and if you listen long enough, the promise will tell you what it was for." Elmer had been listening to promises for 57 years, and he had gotten so he could tell the difference between a lock made to keep a boy out of a liquor cabinet and a lock made to keep a truth safe from history. He paid the auctioneer's clerk in cash, 3 tens, 2 fives, and 5 singles, and he carried the case out to his truck himself, though it was heavier than it should have been, and the walk across the gravel lot made his shoulder ache. Bud Halloran was standing by his Cadillac with a cigar in his teeth, and he called out one more time, hollering that if Elmer found $1 million in there, he ought to at least split it, and the men with him laughed again. Elmer did not answer. He set the case down carefully in the truck bed on an old wool blanket, and he tied it with baling twine so it would not slide, and he drove home at 35 miles an hour the whole way, the way he always drove, because he had learned young that a man who hurries breaks things that took other people a long time to make. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. Elmer's shop stood behind his house on Coulter Road, a low building of cinder block and tin roof with a single window and a hand-painted sign that said "Coin, Lock, and Key." Inside, it smelled of graphite and machine oil and the faint sweetness of the coffee he brewed on a hot plate in the corner. There was a workbench along the long wall, and above the bench hung his tools, each one on a nail with its shape drawn behind it in pencil, so he would know if anything was missing. His picks were laid out in a leather roll like a surgeon's instruments, and his files were sorted by cut, from bastard down to a fine Swiss No. 4. He set the case on the bench under the gooseneck lamp, and he took off his cap, and he sat down on the stool, and he looked at it for a long time without touching it. He did not open it that night. He did not open it the next night either. What he did was study it. He turned it over and looked at the underside where a strip of green felt had come loose at one corner, and he saw that someone had lined the interior bottom of the case with a second layer of something, because the felt was not glued to the wood beneath it, but to another surface, thinner. He weighed the case on his postal scale and made a note in his ledger. He measured its dimensions and made another note. He tapped the sides gently with the eraser end of a pencil and listened, tilting his head the way a doctor tilts his head at a chest. Word got around, the way word gets around in a town of 1,800 people where the coffee at Merle's Diner cost a quarter and the same 12 men had been drinking it every morning for 30 years. By the following Tuesday, everyone in Miller's Ford knew that old Elmer Coyne had paid $45 for a lunchbox that wouldn't open. The joke got told and retold until it wore a groove in the town's memory. At Merle's, Bud Halloran held court in the back booth and told the story with new flourishes every time, about how Elmer had probably bought himself a case full of dead moths and disappointment, and how you could always count on the old-timers to spend good money on bad ideas. Ray Deemer, who had known Elmer since the Truman administration and who ran the feed store next to the post office, came out to the shop on a Thursday evening with a paper bag of pears from his tree. He set the bag on the bench, and he looked at the case, and he scratched the back of his neck. "Elmer," he said, "you gonna tell me what you saw?" Elmer was filing a blank for a customer's back door, and he did not look up. "It'll open," he said. Ray nodded slowly. The way a man nods when he has been given an answer he does not fully believe but has decided to respect. He ate a pear and watched Elmer work for a while, and then he went home. The case had belonged, though nobody in Miller's Ford in 1978 remembered this clearly, to a man named Harlan Pruitt, who had died in 1953 at the age of 44 and whose estate had sat in probate and in storage and in the back rooms of relatives who did not want it for a quarter of a century before finally coming up at auction that spring. Harlan Pruitt had been the bookkeeper for the Miller's Ford Cooperative Grain and Feed Association, and in the winter of 1952 he had been accused of embezzling $11,400 from the co-op's accounts. The accusation had been made by the co-op's president, a man named Cleon Halloran, who was Bud Halloran's father, and it had been made loudly and often, and it had been made in the pages of the county newspaper. Harlan Pruitt had denied it. He had said, in the one interview he gave before he stopped speaking to anyone at all, that the books would show the truth if a person read them carefully. But the books had been audited by an accountant Cleon Halloran had hired from Des Moines, and the accountant had said the numbers pointed to Harlan, and the sheriff had begun to prepare charges. Harlan Pruitt had gone home to his small white house on Elm Street one Tuesday evening in February of 1953, and he had sat down at his kitchen table, and he had written something at length, and then he had gone out to his garage, and he had died there of a self-inflicted wound before the charges were ever filed. His wife had found him. There had been no note, or so the sheriff had said at the time, and the shame of it had driven his widow Ada and their daughter Ruth out of town within the year. Ada Pruitt had died in 1961 in a boarding house in Cedar Rapids. Ruth had been 14 when they left Miller's Ford, and she was 39 now, and she taught 4th grade in a town called Blairsburg, 2 counties over. She had not been back to Miller's Ford since the day she and her mother had loaded the Buick and driven west. What Harlan Pruitt had done in the last week of his life was take his ledgers home from the co-op office and copy every relevant entry into a second set of books in his own hand, and had written a long letter explaining what he had found and who had actually taken the money, and had sealed all of it inside the typewriter case he had used at his kitchen table for 11 years. He had wrapped the seam with electrician's tape, and he had scratched his own name off the plate because he wanted whoever opened it to open it without knowing who they were opening it for, so they would judge the contents on the contents themselves. And then he had locked the case with a small brass lock, and he had put the key in a place no one would ever find, which turned out to be inside his own coat pocket, which was buried with him. Elmer Coyne did not know any of this, not on that Thursday evening when Ray Deemer brought him pears, and not on the Friday or the Saturday that followed, but he had begun to feel the shape of it. He had lived long enough to know that some objects carry weight that a scale cannot measure, and this case carried that kind of weight. He worked on it slowly. He did not force the lock. Anton Rise had taught him that forcing a lock is the mark of a man who does not deserve to know what is behind it, and that a real locksmith opens what wants to be opened and leaves the rest to God. He began with the tape, peeling it back a 1/4 inch at a time with a dental pick, warmed slightly in his palm so the old adhesive would release without tearing. The tape came away in strips, and beneath it the leather seam of the case was intact, dark with age. Then he turned to the lock itself, a small brass affair made by the Corbin Company sometime in the late 1932, and he took down his finest picks, and he sat with the case in his lap. Opening a lock by feel is not like anything else a person does with their hands. It is a conversation. The pick goes in, and the tension wrench holds the plug, and the pins inside speak one at a time in tiny clicks and small refusals, and the locksmith listens and answers. Elmer worked for 3 nights on that little brass lock, not because it was hard, but because he did not want to bruise the pins. He wanted the case to be a case that could still be locked afterward. That was the difference between him and everyone else. He wanted to leave the thing better than he found it. On the 3rd night, which was a Sunday, and which was raining a soft, slow spring rain against the tin roof of the shop, Elmer felt the last pin lift and settle into the shear line, and he turned the tension wrench with his thumb, and the lock opened with a small, dry sound, like a held breath finally letting go. He did not lift the lid right away. He set the picks down on the bench, and he wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his belt, and he sat there in the yellow light, and he looked at the closed case for a long minute out of respect. Then he lifted the lid. Inside the case, packed as tight as a man could pack a thing, were 3 items. On top was a leather portfolio containing a stack of hand-copied ledger pages, 47 of them, each one written in a small, precise hand in blue-black ink, with dates and account numbers and names, and at the bottom of the last page a signed and dated statement in the same hand. Beneath the portfolio was an envelope, sealed, containing $4,200 in $20 bills, which was the whole of Harlan Pruitt's private savings set aside for his daughter's college. And beneath the envelope, folded once, was a letter written on cream-colored paper. The letter was addressed to whoever opens this. Elmer took his reading glasses out of his shirt pocket, and he settled them on his nose, and he read the letter through once without stopping, and then he read it through a second time, more slowly, and then he set it down on the bench, and he took off his glasses, and he sat for a long while with his hands folded in his lap. The letter said that the writer was Harlan Pruitt, and that if a person was reading these words, then he was already dead, because he had decided the night before that he would not live to see his name destroyed in the courts of a town he had loved his whole life. He said that he had not taken the money. He said the money had been taken over a period of 18 months by Cleon Halloran, who had been using the co-op's operating account to cover losses in a private cattle venture that had gone bad in Nebraska. He said the ledger pages in the portfolio showed every transaction and every transfer cross-referenced to Cleon Halloran's personal bank statements, copies of which he had obtained through a cousin who worked at the bank. He said the $4,200 was for his daughter Ruth's education, and that whoever found this was welcome to take $100 for their trouble. But he asked, in the name of a decent man's memory, that the rest be delivered to Ruth Pruitt, and that the ledger pages be delivered to the sheriff or to a newspaper or to anyone who would read them out loud so that his name might be returned to him. Elmer sat in his shop and listened to the rain. He could have kept it. He could have burned the letter in the wood stove in the corner and pocketed the $4,200 and never said a word to anyone, and no one on earth would ever have known. That thought went through him honestly, the way honest thoughts do, and he considered it, and he set it aside. He was not tempted, exactly. He was only aware, in the way an old man is aware of his own reflection in a dark window, that another man in his place might have chosen differently, and he was grateful, in a quiet way, that he had been made the man he was. The next morning, which was Monday, Elmer put the portfolio and the envelope and the letter back into the case, and he closed the lid but did not lock it, and he set the case on the passenger seat of his truck. He drove first to the sheriff's office in the county seat, 41 miles away, and he sat down across from Sheriff Bill Danner, who had been a deputy in 1953 and who remembered Harlan Pruitt. And he opened the case and he laid the ledger pages on the sheriff's desk, and he said only, "I believe these belong to the record." Then he drove to Blairsburg. It took him another 2 hours, and he had to stop and ask directions twice, but he found the elementary school, and he waited in the parking lot until the last bell rang and the children came out, and he watched from his truck until he saw a tired, dignified woman in a brown coat come out and lock the door behind her. He got out, and he took off his cap, and he introduced himself, and he said he had something that had belonged to her father. He gave her the envelope and the letter, and he did not stay to be thanked, because he knew she would need to be alone with it. He drove home at 35 miles an hour the whole way. The story broke in the county paper 11 days later, and then in the Des Moines Register the week after that. The ledger pages were authenticated by 2 independent accountants, and the bank statements were subpoenaed and matched. And by the end of May, the name of Harlan Pruitt had been formally cleared by a county resolution that was read aloud at a meeting of the Board of Supervisors. Cleon Halloran had been dead 9 years by then, and could not answer for what he had done. But the money that had been taken was, by court order, restored from the remainder of his estate to the co-op, and from there a memorial fund was established in Harlan Pruitt's name for the education of the children. Bud Halloran said very little in those weeks. He was seen at Merle's Diner exactly twice in the month of June, and he sat in a different booth than his usual one, and he did not tell any jokes. His insurance business began to lose customers that summer and the next, and by the autumn of 1980 he had sold the storefront and moved to a subdivision outside of Fort Myers, Florida, where his name was painted on no windows and where nobody had ever heard of a locked typewriter case. The case itself, at Ruth Pruitt's request, was donated to the Millers Ford Historical Society and placed in a glass display in the reading room of the public library, with the ledger pages beside it, and a small brass plaque that told the story of Harlan Pruitt in 4 short paragraphs. His name was returned to him by the patient hand of a neighbor. Elmer Coyne went to see it exactly once, on a Wednesday evening in September of 1978, when the library was almost empty and the low sun was coming through the west windows in long gold bars. He stood at a distance of about 8 feet from the glass case, and he held his cap in his hands, and he looked at the black typewriter case, sitting there under the lights, with its lid propped open and its brass corners polished, and he stood there for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he put his cap back on, and he walked out, and he drove home in the rust-red pickup, and he did not speak of it to anyone, not that evening, and not ever. So I'll leave it with you. If a locked case had come into your hands with $4,200 inside it, and no living soul who knew what you had found, would you have driven the 41 miles to the sheriff and the 2 hours after that to a school teacher you had never met?